Everyone, and thank you for being at the Public Safety Committee meeting this morning. We have one topic that we're going to discuss, a very important topic, but we have one topic today, which is a briefing on police training, and there's no action or no vote taken. And we're going to begin by asking Susan Farag to lead us through, and then we'll meet the panel, please.
Good morning, everyone. Susan Farag, Council staff. I am going to present the PowerPoint presentation to you today, and then if you have any questions you want to ask the police, they're here to answer any of the answers in detail that you would like to discuss.
Well, before we begin, could we have the group explain who they are, please?
Good morning, Chief Marcus Jones, Montgomery County Police.
Captain Jason Kokinos, I'm the Director of Training and Education.
Good morning, Dinesh Patil. I'm the Acting Assistant Chief for the Management Services Bureau for the County Police.
Thank you all for being with us. Susan, if you could please lead us through.
Sure. This was an item that we discussed with the committee chair about doing a deep dive on a topic under public safety. And so he determined that we should do police training. And I gathered some national data through the Department of Justice's Bureau of Justice Statistics Census of Law Enforcement Training Academies. They do this periodically. It's not like on a once every 5 years basis. And the information contained in this today was gathered in 2013 and published in 2016. That's the most recent data I have. They did do a survey in 2018, and the results of that are expected to be published this year. And I will update the committee with that information as soon as we get it.
Okay.
The first thing I'd like to talk about a little bit is national practices. There are 664 state and local law enforcement academies across the nation. Each year they train about 45,000 new recruits. Training standards for each must comply with federal, state, and local regulations. So what one academy has to do, a different academy might have different standards. They all obviously have to comport with federal law, but state and local regulations, as well as what they've developed internally, may be different. Academies are also often accredited with entities such as CALEA, and that's the Commission on Accreditation of Law Enforcement Agencies, and that might add additional training requirements or more in-depth training requirements. Nearly half of all police academies across the nation are based at 2- and 4-year colleges or technical schools. Academies average 21 full-time staff and 32 part-time instructors. Most academies hold 2 classes a year. All the academies were also asked what their smallest class was and what their largest class was. Their median smallest class was 14, and their median largest class was 28. For training subjects, the survey asks academies about almost 50 different training subjects and the number of hours of training that's provided for each. At the most basic level, this survey groups subjects into 4 broad categories, including operations, weapons and defensive tactics, self-improvement, and legal education. While this methodology provides a broad overview of the types of training provided, it does not capture different training subjects that may span multiple elements of training. Nationally, the most required of these subjects I just mentioned for training hours are in the area of operations, and that includes more than 200 hours per recruit. An average of 168 hours were required for training on weapons, defensive tactics, and the use of force. Recruits spend 89 hours training in self-improvement categories such as health and fitness and stress prevention. And recruits spend an average of 86 hours in legal education. For the Montgomery County Police Academy, they provide 1,000 hours or 25 weeks of basic training at the academy. After that, if somebody has successfully completed academy training, they go on to 540 hours or 14 weeks of field training. The training program there meets the Maryland Police Correctional Training Commission's minimum requirements, as all academies in the state of Maryland must. It also meets CALEA requirements. It meets certain federal requirements, and that includes FEMA instruction. And it also reflects court rulings such as Armstrong v. Pinehurst, which was a Fourth Circuit ruling in 2016 that dealt with excessive use of force in the application of a taser. As far as hours of training, this is how Montgomery County's academy matches up to different types of academies across the nation. We have 1,540 hours total, and that includes basic training and field training. That's edged out only by municipal police departments at 1566 and special jurisdiction academies at 1568. With respect to staffing at the academy, they currently have 36 full-time staff, 0 part-time, although they do bring in adjunct instructors from the police districts and other assignments to teach specialty topics. Nationally, as a comparison, most academies have an average of 21 full-time instructors and 32 part-time structures. These two charts show staffing compared to class size. On the left, it shows that nationally they have 37 staff for 35 recruits. An average class size is 35. And MCPD has 36 staff for an average of 50 recruits per class. The other chart shows the staff-recruit ratio. This indicates that Montgomery County Police Academy is training more recruits with fewer staff. I've also got a snapshot of the 2018 classes. They had 2 classes, I believe, but this is just aggregated. A breakdown of male and female recruits. 77 males started the academy, 69 finished successfully. 24 females started the academy, and 17 finished successfully. Overall, there's a national average of an 86% completion rate in all academies. This reflects by sex, 90% completion rate by men, and 71% completion rate by women. As a breakdown by race and ethnicity, as you can see, 8 Asian recruits started and completed the academy, 10 Hispanic or Latino recruits started and 9 completed the academy, 19 Black or African American recruits started and 16 completed the academy, and 64 white recruits started and 53 completed the academy in 2018. I've broken down into 4 broad groups as discussed before, different subject areas, and this is comparing Montgomery County to national experience. These are operations training which includes the largest number of hours of training for recruits. And this breaks it down into computers, training, traffic incident investigation, vehicle operations, report writing, patrol procedures, regular investigations, and basic first aid and CPR. And Montgomery County edges out in most areas. It significantly trains more in patrol procedures. And it's on par with emergency vehicle operations as well as investigations compared to national data. Regarding weapons and defense tactics, again, Montgomery County edges out national averages. There had been a typo on a survey that was completed which indicated Montgomery County only did 40 hours of firearms training. They actually do 80 at this point. This next slide was interesting to me, which the police might be able to talk to a little bit as far as self-improvement training, which includes stress prevention, professionalism, and ethics and integrity. We lag behind the national average in all 3 areas, which I thought was important to bring to your attention considering the view on mental health as far as first responders are involved and what supports are in place for them. As far as legal training, the Police Academy edges out national experience in traffic law, criminal and constitutional law, and is slightly lagging behind in juvenile justice law. And I broke out these special topics of training just based on what the council and the community at large have been interested in over the past several years. I did include terrorism, although we haven't discussed that much just because of our proximity to the national capital. Montgomery County Police get 4 hours of training in that compared to the national average of 9. As far as community policing, Montgomery County provides 81 hours of training in community policing compared to the national average of 43. It also provides 64 hours of mental illness training compared to the national average of 10.
Susan, just so I understand what you're saying, this is during the recruits training?
Yes.
Right? This does not go back and say that if you had specialized people in certain areas, investigation or whatnot, does that include the training that they'd be receiving?
No, this is just for
Just as during the
academy.
time that a recruit, that a person is going through before they become a sworn police officer?
Right, the recruit class. There is other training provided at the academy that provides specialized training based on different assignments.
But that does not
That's not
reflect that here?
reflected here.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Hate crimes and bias crimes, Montgomery County receives 8 hours of training in that versus 3 hours of the national average. Gangs is lagging behind the national average a bit, 2 hours compared to 4 hours nationally, And domestic violence also is interesting. 2 hours of training is provided here to Montgomery County recruits versus 13 on the national average. Community policing training is broken down by the CLE.
Susan, 1 second.
Sure.
Councilmember Hucker, please.
Thanks. I wasn't, good morning, everybody. I wasn't sure if you wanted questions as we go along. Would you mind flipping back one slide? Susan, thank you. I'm just curious about, I think I'm relieved and happy to see mental illness. We're ahead of the national curve on community policing and mental illness and the emphasis on those and on hate crimes as well. But I wouldn't have expected that we're behind the national average on gangs, domestic violence, or in this area, terrorism. Can you comment?
So we could comment, Councilman Hooker. One of the things that it's not included in this slide is that we encompass a lot of this type of training into different other types of training that we have. For example,
After the academy.
no, during the academy. So, for example, when you look at domestic violence, you could say that's 2 hours of classroom training, but there's other domestic violence training that's correlated to that goes into our law blocks when you have to when you're actually studying law, involving understanding what domestic laws that are on the books and how we are to enforce them. And we also instituted in our actual scenario-based training. So when you're actually doing training where you're actually taking a recruit and having them go and handle a domestic dispute, that is actually a part of the training. So that's not highlighted in that particular type of in that particular block. Gang, same thing. When you talk about constitutional, I mean, as far as the law updates and the law changes, they are brought into, they are tested on those, on the laws and understanding all of the gangs that are, these are more or less the blocks themselves that we bring in for the specific instructors to come in and actually teach those blocks.
Thank you. That makes some sense. But are you saying that that's not included in the hours associated with that number in the national?
I don't think so. I think the way they probably calculate it is different than the way we calculate it. So again, I would just suggest that, we, not only do we do these types of blocks of trainings that are at the academy level, but you also are doing in-service type training that you're actually bringing folks back, and we do also optional classes for individuals to come in and actually do more extensive training on different blocks such as gangs and domestic violence as officers' careers as they proceed.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Please, Susan.
Policing training, the national survey broke this down into 4 areas. And this is how it's reflected. MCPD compares nationally for cultural diversity and human relations. The national average officers receive 12 hours of this in the academy. MCPD officers receive 10 hours. As far as mediation and conflict management, MCPD provides 64 hours of training in this area compared to the national average of 9. Again, in community partnership building, Montgomery County provides 2 versus 10 hours reflecting the national average, and for problem solving approaches, 4 hours for Montgomery County versus 12 nationally. Mental illness training, again, MCPD provides 64 hours in the academy versus the national average of 10. And then this is one thing that the survey captures that I wanted to talk a little bit about, the stress versus non-stress training approaches. And a stress approach would be the classic military model, which is very demanding physically and psychologically, and most police departments started off that way. A non-stress model is more relaxed and has supportive instructor-student relationship. And there are differing opinions out there in the literature on which approach is better for modern policing, which is more community and solution-oriented. One study found that the non-stress approach trained recruits who were trained in a non-stress manner performed at significantly higher levels in field performance, job satisfaction, and performance acceptability by persons served. However, on the stress side, there was a study conducted that indicated that the brain switches to different judgment systems in high-stress situations, and one of the sociologists that was commenting on this study indicated Put plainly, when cops mess up, the explanations offered tend to be ethical and political, when the more empirically solid explanations are basic human failures under stress. So they indicate that the best training methods involve training in realistic environments, including anxiety-inducing measures and tactical decision-making scenarios. These are the types of reality-based mock scenarios that are provided nationally. All police academies provide some stress training. The amount they provide differs. Montgomery County offers all of these mock scenarios, and they also do an equal balance of stress and non-stress training. On the national level...
Susan, I don't know that your mic is on.
I'm sorry. On the national level, 23% of academies report that they do all or most stress, and an additional 26% indicate that they do more stress than not. And again, Montgomery County provides all of these mock scenario types of training, and it has a balanced stress and non-stress training. What I have not included in the PowerPoint is information on field training as well as in-service training. That was not gathered by the survey other than how many hours are provided, but the information is provided to you inside of the packet. Starting on page 8. Again, they have 14 weeks of field service training. Probationary officers are assigned to a field training officer and must complete every enumerated task in the probationary officer's handbook, and that's attached at 58 through 86. This presents an exhaustive list of tasks and skills that police must demonstrate proficiently. As far as in-service training, that's governed by the Maryland Police and Correctional Training Commission requirements, and they must have a minimum of 18 hours of in-service training per year. And you can see on pages 8 and 9 the different topics that they provide, including firearms, taser, rifle, shotgun, autism, the study of criminal laws concerning sex offenses. CALEA adds additional standards, including use of force, protective instruments, firearms, legal updates, bias-based policing. This is required biennially. However, Montgomery County Police does bias-based policing training annually. As far as FEMA requirements, that includes incident command issues. The National Safety Council requires CPR biennially, and then MCPD also has additional training that it requires, listed on page 9. I did want to note that they have increased the frequency of their bias-based policing and mental health training to be annually for in-service training for police officers. There's some discussion issues listed at the bottom of that page for you if the committee is interested in asking that, and again, the police are available to answer any questions.
Very good. And I did want to mention, and Councilmember Auburn has questions too, but I did want to mention that we received an email from Councilmember Evan Glass, who he has said, and he's had some discussions with Chief Jones about the strengthening relations with the LGBTQ plus community. They've talked about concerns that the community currently have, specific concerns regarding the department's handling of domestic violence, sexual assault, and the use of pronouns. Having a cultural competent department, I'm reading obviously, having a culturally competent department is very important to all of us in county leadership. Toward that end, I'm curious about what conversation has taken place about cultural competency training for the department, and if discussions have taken place, what are the expected next steps? And we'll get to that, but I wanted you to think about that as Councilmember Auburn asked his question. It could be the same questions, but anyway, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. President. So was that the end of the presentation then? Okay, so now the Q&A. First of all, thank you guys for everything that you do. I've had the opportunity to attend now 4 installations, and just you can tell that there is a real sense of camaraderie of the team as they go through this arduous and challenging process. And I know MCPD has a long history of not just providing high-quality training, but also recruiting further upstream to make sure that officers that go through this training are prepared even before they go through the training. So I just want to sort of start from that place. I had a couple specific questions with regards to the presentation. A few slides ago, we talked about patrol procedures as sort of a broad category. If you could more define what that entails and what that encompasses, that would be helpful.
Good morning. So patrol procedures is it's a block of instruction that's scenario based. So they will, at that point, have received classroom instruction on criminal law, dealing with people, professional, contact with the community, communication, things of that nature, tactical training with regards to room entries and building searches. And that training then turns into a patrol procedure block where they get split up into pairs, like having a partner. They will be dispatched to a particular call or scenario. They will respond and then have to demonstrate the academic that they learned in the classroom in a hands-on scenario-based. Could involve dealing with an autistic child, could involve a domestic situation, an alarm in a residence, could be various different things that they're then, it's more of a reality hands-on phase that they're graded on.
Okay, that's helpful. And obviously, there are some national standards and state standards from which we have to draw from, but it sounds from the presentation that there's a fair amount of flexibility in how we adjust our own training. How has the training evolved, let's just say in the last 10 years? Obviously, the county has changed significantly. We've become, just from a demographic sense, but also just the concentration of our population of people around our burgeoning urban areas. How has the training evolved in the last, let's just say, 10 years?
So I think probably the best way to summarize that, and I'm happy to get into greater detail, but is that we're constantly watching current events. We're working with our community leaders, working with the community to, I think every community kind of sets the tone on how they want to be policed or what the issues are important. And as things evolve, what I think one of the things about Montgomery County is that it makes us very different and on a leading edge is that we pivot and we adapt to those things. So we look at our internal policies, we look at incidents that occur, both whether it's a critical incident that maybe gets immediate attention, or day to day what's working and what is not working, and then we're able to every year our in-service training, where officers go back to required training, some of which is online, some of which is in person. And as we set that agenda or course of study for that year, we look at what has happened and where do we need to make some adjustments. Some of that, the bane of everybody's existence in our training world is bloodborne pathogens. We're mandated. Every year we have to learn about that. It's important. It's a safety issue to make sure that we stay healthy. But then we can also say, okay, we have a certain amount of time. Maybe we need to focus on driving because we're having too many accidents and it's a safety issue. Maybe we need to look at body-worn camera compliance and how are we doing, in that world to make sure that people understand the technology. Professional policing, law updates that may change. So some of it's driven by, how the world changes and it's put upon us from, okay, this has changed, we now have to adapt, and some of it is looking internally and then being able to pivot based on what we see, and I think that's the big difference. And part of, I think what gives us that flexibility is with that timing of in-service every year is you don't have to wait 5 years to deliver it, right? You're always kind of in a rotation, is the use of technology to be able to deliver online training, whether it's in the police station or even in the police car. We have great technology in the area. We have a computer pretty much in every one of our marked patrol cars. And as we look at cell phones and different things for the future, I think we have a way to do to keep people fresh and relevant. And again, on the big ones, we bring people in because I think training is not just a matter of us delivering a statement and giving material, but especially on the bigger issues, it's also about having a conversation, making sure that everybody leaves with the same amount of understanding.
That's helpful. I guess there's nothing that I saw on the slide specific to cultural training. I'm sure that's incorporated in different ways in various elements of the training itself. And cultural competency training is a big umbrella and can be done many different ways. And when I say cultural competency training, I certainly include racial and ethnic, but it also is an age issue. How we address our aging population, how we address our youth. So if you could talk a little bit about how specifically you're focusing on cultural competency training, what that looks like, how it's incorporated, how much thought is given each year into making adjustments as necessary, that would be helpful.
So we have been, this is something that we took very seriously, and it's something they went back to as in the mid-2000s or early 2000s, around 2006, we developed a relevant cultural diversity training for our department and that every officer had to go through, rookies, and we continued that through our recruit classes all the way through. And we focused on just what you spoke of racial, ethnic, but we also talked on generational differences. We talked about the youth. We talked about sort of how our youth now engage in a younger, how we're dealing with the younger society sometimes, and what are some of the demands and things that they have, and how do the relationship build with them in order to be productive in the public safety realm. Also with again, and even in our Asian community. But we also looked at it from sexual orientation. We talked about LGBTQ relationships and defining that, and what insults people, what is something that is really kind of, that these are the things that we caution all of our officers about, but particularly when we bring our new recruits in, to make sure that they're educated on these things of people, of the differences that they're going to encounter. We also talked about religion. We talked about it particularly in a very unique community where we have a lot of religions in our community. We need them to understand, that there are different cultural differences from a perspective of how they worship. What are some of the expectations that they have when dealing with law enforcement? And a lot of this was centered simply around dealing with that. We have traditionally taken our recruits down to the Holocaust Museum as part of their field, as part of their academy experience. And we have been doing that since like really about the late 90s. The Holocaust Museum has a specific program as it relates to law enforcement. And it really is a great experience to have the officers go through to actually visit the museum and understand history from that perspective. And then when the National African American Museum opened a few years back, about 2+ years ago, we began to take all of our recruits to that. So that is a part of them to, again, understand some history between law enforcement relationships and the African American community, and to understand why there's been this push and pull, you might say, or this relationship that hasn't been always positive in many of our communities, and particularly in Montgomery County. And we're still, in fact, even looking at that to be able to engage that in a way that encompasses even a Montgomery County component of that, so people understand the history of relationships here in Montgomery County and why that's been some problems. In fact, I don't know if you all have ever been to the National African American Museum, but there's even one, and I always pointed out when I would go with the recruits to show them that there was a Montgomery County display that's actually there, and I want them to make sure that they're aware of that. But again, that's something that I think is vitally important to the success of our academy, in order to make sure, again, just if you're just teaching one class, we always spoke about that you could teach that class an entire college semester in reality. It's so much information to be shared, but we wanted to give our officers a baseline of dealing with relationships building and why that's important with these different communities, regardless of whether you're dealing with the youth or you're dealing with seniors, you're dealing with people of color, Latinos. We talk about the difference in the Latino community, Hispanic community, in the sense of really getting them to understand the different cultures, even subcultures of that particular a group of folks. That I think that, again, when we look at the growing group of Hispanics in our community, that the officers need to understand those, and how people, acknowledge the groups that countries that they come from, how much pride they have in that, and how we have to give that some respect and pride in our own dealings with them in order to better understand. The main gist of this is to get folks to open up their minds, to have a better understanding of somebody that's different than them, that they don't maybe share the same culture, they don't share the same, characteristics of just like we would say in some communities, you have individuals that look you right in your face, And then you'll have some cultures that don't look away from you when you speak to them. That doesn't mean that they're being distrustful or being deceitful. That just means that that's a cultural aspect of them that maybe just that they do, and so that doesn't mean that you treat them any differently. And so that's some of the things that we've taught along the way, and we try to continue that type of instruction throughout our academy and beyond. So.
Thank you, Chief. I have a few questions. I'm going to ask one more now and then defer to my colleagues who I know have questions as well, and then maybe jump back in. But final question for right this moment is, how do we track the success of the training program? How do we quantify that? Are we surveying participants and then checking back in with them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5+ years into their service and going back to correlate that to training? How are we making decisions on the adjustment of the training and tracking whether or not we can credibly say the training is working?
So one thing we do is, we do this for recruit training and training that is held for in-service and things of that nature. We do surveys. So the recruits, when they finish the recruit training, they'll take a survey, express what they liked, what they didn't like, what they thought was helpful, what wasn't. We do the same thing with course evaluations for training. So from the training division standpoint, we look at, and I track over years, okay, hey, the recruits are saying now 2-3 years, this area they could be doing, they didn't feel they had enough, so we can make some adjustments in that fashion. Also, the one thing I do is I speak frequently, discussions that I can have with our internal affairs director. Hey, what trends are you seeing? Can I get ahead of that in training? So, and talking with the chief and things of that nature. So it's not just an evaluation from the user of the course, but looking at a more global view of, and then looking at national things. So something happens in law enforcement somewhere else. How can I prevent that here? Or if something does happen, we have what's called a use of force review committee that will look at an incident and say, hey, this happened. Is there a training lens that we could have done something different to better help this officer or this community member in this scenario? And we factor that in.
So I think, building on Captain's point, so we gauge our performance. So while we don't necessarily survey 5 years down the road, hey, was this training, did you find it effective 5 years ago? We're constantly gauging performance, whether it's on use of force, whether it's on driving, whether it's community relations is something a little bit mushier to gauge, but we're whether it's a weekly performance meeting that we have internally with all of our command staff, the chief's meeting every week, we're constantly evaluating the environment and our performance measures, and then adjusting the training to meet that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, and welcome to Councilmember Jawando. When some of the questions that we had as a discussion points, one of the questions is about adjunct instructors, and that about overtime, and often, many times, you'll bring in an expert who's specialized for specialized training. Is that something that is being done for efficiency, or is that something that means we need more instructors who are assigned directly to the training academy?
The answer to that is both to some degree. So there are some aspects of training that within that program that are very specialized, and we'll bring, for example, if it's domestic violence, we may have an instructor that works in that section of the department, is very skilled in that. There are times where staffing needs fluctuate. So for example, when we do these scenarios, the patrol procedures, or we have a conflict management dealing with people scenarios where we're interacting with role players, that is kind of a short-term need for about 30 to 40 additional staff just to play the role players. We have safety officers, scenario managers. So we will bring in adjuncts to help with that. But now you're talking for something like with regards to like our emergency vehicles operation program, we will bring adjuncts in on overtime to supplement a staffing gap. So we are short instructors in my view. So it's not really a one way or the other, it's kind of both. We use the overtime for special circumstances, but there are cases where additional staffing would aid.
And I think as time goes on, our training needs are only going to evolve and grow. One example, if the current negotiated contract proceeds forward and goes through, we'll have tasers issued to 600 more officers, which means they're also going to go through CIT training. That's something we agreed that we need to continue doing. That's 36,000 hours of training that we currently are not staffed or necessarily budgeted for. So I don't, although we may gain efficiencies over the years with technology in certain ways, I believe our population will grow. I believe the needs and complexity of policing will grow, and thus the training and the demands that we put on our academy staff and the adjuncts will continue to expand.
And the whole concept for body-worn cameras is, right now, though of course, I'm sure that it's involved in the training as well, but do all of our officers now have body-worn cameras?
No, so the body-worn camera program originally was designed that with the collective bargaining agreement was agreed upon that officers would volunteer for the program. So at this point in time, we don't have all of our patrol officers equipped with body-worn cameras. We are moving in this collective bargaining agreement with we're hoping to have an agreement and this contract to go through that we would move towards having all of our patrol officers at some point. Now, it would be a phased-in approach. It wouldn't be right away. But we're trying to get to a point that we're moving towards the majority of our officers having them, yes.
Chief, I think we're talking about two different things. I think
Oh, I'm sorry.
You-
Oh, I'm
what the
sorry.
chief just mentioned
I'm
was-
sorry, I'm thinking about tasers, I'm sorry. So that was a taser answer. The body-worn camera answer is every patrol officer has them.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I don't know why my head was there, but
Even you
it's
were
all
allowed
good.
to have a moment.
Thank you, I
mean,
appreciate
even
that,
you,
thank
yeah.
you.
But I'm glad that that's the answer for tasers rather than body-worn cameras, because I think it's become more and more obvious, and from our next-door neighbors in Prince George's County, how these are very necessary things that the public requires and that we require, so. For the whole idea for in-service training beyond the training academy, how often, I know that there is certain specifics, I mean, whether it's for firearms or whatever, but how often does an officer come back to receive additional training once they're out of the academy?
So there's various different parts to that. So the annual in-service is a minimum of 18 hours. They'll come to the academy. There's 2 days where there's state mandated and department topics that we'll teach them. There's online training that they'll take as well, incorporated in that. But then officers will come to the academy to do weapons qualifications. If they have specialty weapons like patrol rifles, they have to come every 6 months, shotguns. Then we have the TASER program where you'll have to come back for a half day and do an annual recertification, a use of force update. So at a minimum, we have 18 hours that officers will come to the do some in-service, whether it's online or in the classroom, and then any specialty stuff. This year, starting in 2020, we've incorporated a mandatory driver's training, which officers are now coming to with our goal to reduce accidents and make the community safer for our officers operating vehicles. So, and then there's other specialty training. So our district community action teams come back for a day of in-service. We have our traffic motorcycle officers, different things of that. Our FTOs come back for special training, so it's really a wide, realm.
And on top of all that, we also have an elective catalog, like you would kind of find in a college environment for people who want to expand their career enhancement, focus on special topics. We have a catalog every year where we offer blocks of instruction for people to learn more about different topics that they may be interested in. And then in the middle of all that, you could have a completely unplanned situation, or maybe something that you add, hey, we found a particular issue we need to really put focus on right at the moment, and we do. You'll get technology updates. We're going to be releasing a new body camera this year, just an upgrade, but there are both policy and technological advancements, and so we're looking that how do you limit the amount of time you pull officers off the road, because that's important as well as training is important. So we look to where we can find some overlap, and that's one example right now is we're looking to just potential of delivering cell phones to officers maybe you combine that training into one and try to make it as efficient as possible. So there's elective and required training and then specialized unit training as well.
And I know that you did answer Councilmember Alberniz's question, but to the specific for Councilmember Glass email, is there any additional information you wanted to share with that, please, with his question?
So Councilmember Glass's office was in contact with me, reference doing an electronic introduction with a group that could aid in that category. Actually, last Friday, I made we had some phone tag, did make contact with a person, and then we're supposed to follow up this week to discuss what services that they may be able to share information and things of that nature for the topics that he discussed. So we are actively pursuing that from Councilmember Glass's office.
Thank you very much. We understand phone tag down here, let me just tell you. Councilmember Jawando, please. Oh, I'm sorry, you didn't have your, go ahead.
I thought you always say they don't work.
Go ahead.
Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize if I miss any of these in the packet, but does MCPD have any sort of early intervention system to detect officers that might benefit from additional training or guidance? What does that look like?
So, yeah, so there are a couple of ways that can happen. So one of the ways that we work with our supervisors, that if they see an officer who's not performing at a level that is acceptable in any facet of their duties, that they are to work with the training academy to bring them into a sort of a remedial atmosphere in order to rectify those deficiencies. So that's one way. There's also other ways that there's signals that if we think that we have reporting mechanisms, like, for example, in the use of force, as an example, and if we see that there seems to be a pattern of behavior that's not acceptable, that we think that there needs to be some retraining on, we'll take them back to the academy to address those issues as well. So there are ways for us to try to identify that we have employees or officers that might not be meeting the standards that we require. And we, one of the things is for us to pay attention to that, and we have those discussions sometimes when it's required that we look at an employee specifically to make sure that we're addressing the needs that would get them to conform.
Thank you.
Just to build on what she's saying, what I think has been a game changer for us is every use of force incident that we have gets reviewed. The body-worn camera gets reviewed, right? Presume the officer has one, uniformed officer. And even if the use of force may be within policy, it gives you an opportunity to see what's actually happening, where it might have just been before written on a piece of paper, and you read about the event and you go, okay, I guess it was okay. Now you're really getting a glimpse into the moment, and as from it gets reviewed by the sergeant, the lieutenant, and then off to the commander, you get a deeper dive into there to see not just use of force, but day-to-day performance of how we're interacting with the community, and I think that's been a big change in how we used to do business.
That's great. And that's for every use of force incident?
Yes, that where a camera is present.
Is there, and I realize, okay, so if I see something that concerns me, I can report an officer to supervisor. I realize if there's just two of us on patrol and I see something, it's going to be obvious who reported that person. But if it's not that type of scenario, is it possible to make anonymous reports as well?
Yes, there are opportunities for officers if they want to make an anonymous complaint about something the behavior that an officer was exhibited to display. Yes, they absolutely have the opportunity to do that. And that's generally done. They'll generally either report it to their supervisors or they'll generally report it to the Internal Affairs Division. And we get those complaints from time to time about certain behaviors, and for us to look at them and further address them.
Right.
Right.
Is there, in addition to the additional training through the academy and the follow-up, is there any kind of peer review component? I'm not even sure there should be, but I know when the teachers, years ago struggled with how do we get teachers who need additional training, or maybe shouldn't be teachers at all, out of the classroom, and they had the same sort of difficult dynamics with management. They years ago, set up a, sort of a peer review system where you'd have another teacher in your classroom where you could be more sort of candid around them. It didn't feel like your boss was right there, and a review system that was not seen as a gotcha program by, teachers in the classroom, but as actual support and training. And I don't know if, does anything like that exist in the?
So I wouldn't say it's a formal peer review, but I think that if you talk to most officers, when you work on a particular shift, the officers themselves sometimes have an expectations of their performance of their peers. And you will have, for example, our corporals, for the shifts that have corporals as an example, they are deemed to be the lead worker. And so they're sort of your buffer between you and your sergeant, your supervisor.
Right.
And so there are times that the corporal plays a significant role, for example, when they see something that, or somebody brings it to their attention, they'll a lot of times will address that accordingly to that officer. And then a lot of times shifts will do briefings, for example, within themselves, by themselves about how they handle a certain situation and how they address it. And there are times that they get sort of they get a review that sometimes some officers may not actually be keen on hearing, but the officers give this to them because particularly the more veteran officers at times that does happen. But we don't have anything formalized. We've never had anything formalized from that perspective. I would call that the most informal type of.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
Culturally, it
right.
happens, and corporals would be
Exactly,
often
right.
the lead. I'm glad there's a lot of focus on juvenile justice. It seems from my read of it that there's a lot of focus on legal standards and the juvenile and the justice system. Is there training for officers in like social emotional development of youth?
So we go over the juvenile justice system and the juvenile laws. And then we touch on, in our community policing, strategies of teaching with problem solving, diversion other than arrests. So there's things of that nature. I don't think we get as far in depth as, kind of counseling one-on-one with a community member in that setting. We train the officers of the resources that the county offers and to try to help connect people when solving problems with, the crisis center or other things of that nature that might help. We're problem solvers, but there's a balance on what we're equipped to do, and sometimes it's involving some of our partner agencies
Right.
as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think learning from a clinical perspective how adolescent brains operate differently than adult brains, might be helpful.
And I think, so some of that bleeds into the more specialized groups, so there's school resource officers, you spend more time doing maybe that one-on-one kind of mentoring or really intervening, and our special victims unit that investigates a lot of crimes related to children, but I think your point's well taken on an opportunity.
I saw there's only 2 hours of stress management in your graph, and I guess the national average is 6. I'm wondering if you want to comment on that, if that's adequate.
Yes, so the first thing I'll say about the survey is the survey is not, it's not perfect in the sense it doesn't really cover everything we do. There's blocks and you have to fill in numbers, and so it says these are topics and the topic in the classroom. So we have 2-hour stress management block. That's true. However, we do a lot more than that. So we have, it's hard to capture this on the survey. So we actually have 8 hours of training in stress management and 12.5 in scenario-based. So we have 2 hours of the overview of stress management, which is coping with stress, and we identify resources and things of that nature that are available. We have a 2-hour block of surviving critical incidents. We talk about stress response. We then introduce the officers to the peer support unit and things of that nature. We have 12.5 hours of officer survival skills, which include your mindset, dealing with stress in the middle of an incident and after an incident. We do a 2-hour block on substance abuse and how sometimes things going on in life can lead to that, and the awarenesses and resources for that. And then for the recruits, every Friday after they get off, the peer support team comes to the academy. We give them a classroom, and they offer confidential areas where they can decompress, communicate with peer support team members, and things of that nature. So the survey shows 2 hours. It's a lot more than that. Could we be doing more? Absolutely. We do stuff in our in-service training this is a hot topic, obviously, with things going on nationally, that we are looking at how can we do this better with stress management.
And one thing that isn't, I don't think, captured in the survey per se is, we also understand that stress management and resiliency is part of not just the officer or the recruit, but the family around them. So at our family night, where we bring the families in towards the end of the academy and graduation's about to happen, we bring our stress management doctor in to talk to the families and provide literature and guidance and trying to bring that structure a little bit broader beyond just the officer themselves. And additionally, we're looking right now, I think it's this week or next week, we have a meeting to discuss a grant opportunity to bring greater resiliency training in, partnering with a university through a federal grant, because everybody has obviously taken notice of the amount of law enforcement suicides over the last several years, and near and dear to our heart, obviously. So we're constantly looking at where we can gain some ground, but I think Captain spoke well. While there's maybe this 2-hour block from the stress management office, it permeates a lot of other things.
Right. And then just my last question, Chief, we had a lot of discussions about community policing in the fall, and you were nice enough to send me the job description for officers that I looked at. And I don't know how often those are updated, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it per se, but in terms of just messaging, it seems like community policing isn't a consistent emphasis, and partly because there's different terms used. In your program of instruction here, it mentions community policing for an hour and a half under patrol instructions, and then there's, I think, a total, if you include all the community relations stuff in this whole section, there's 90 hours of that with ethics and leadership and hate bias and conflict management, and that's great. But in the job description, it mentions improving community relations once. I think it says community-oriented policing once. There's not like a consistent, and I don't know if in your efforts to attract officers who are going into this with a public service, community engagement, mindset, and are incentivized by that, that might be something to look at, whether it's a little outdated or not. Oh, I was also going to ask, I noted the difference. It's what, almost 3.5 to 1 men in your recruitment class, and still largely white. And I'm wondering if you could update us on your efforts to, and what else you might need from us to attract more women and to attract more people of color.
So just to highlight on what your first comments there is just to note that not only will our recruits, as we look at what's established here in their training, we also look at what they do in 14 weeks of their field training. So that needs to be looked at, because that's where they really get more of a hands-on experience about doing more community engagement with the patrol, with the field training officer that they'll do for 14 weeks. So that needs to just be highlighted. With our rating systems, generally, when we look at making any drastic change, and we've had this discussion over the past several years about making changes to different categories and things, that would have to be bargained with the FOP, and we'd have to all come to an agreement on the language. So, and we've talked about doing that at some point in time in order to better enhance it. Also, there's the ability that supervisors, and they do this, they will add additional commentary into any officer's rating that highlights many of the things that they might be doing from a community engagement perspective, and either are their commanding officer. So with that being said, that can be added. As it relates to our recruitment process, yes, we know that there are several challenges. Again, when we look at the men to female ratio as well as our minorities, we've been doing we've really been, from a recruitment standpoint, really trying to focus much in a larger sense of really trying to work to the really diverse communities. We've talked about this a little bit here before this committee, where we talked about how we've been going about trying to address this with our cadet program, bringing in some diversity from that perspective, and having those folks join our police department after the completion of their 2-year of enrollment with that. We've had some success with that, but there's more work to be done, we know. And again, there's some challenges out there, but we'll continue to confront those challenges.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we're going to try Councilmember Giwando, but before he speaks, I'd like to welcome Councilmember Rice. Please, Councilmember Giwando.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good to join the committee and good to see you all. Thank you for coming in. We had double duty downstairs with education. A couple questions, and following up on Councilmember Hucker's point on the ability to recruit, and then the cultural diversity point. I know there was some questions on that earlier. I met one of your young cadets recently a young Latino man who I promised to come to his graduation when he gets through the program. So I'm glad you mentioned the cadet program. I think that is a really good way to grow your own talent. You know, we talk about it in the teacher context. You know, we want to grow our own people who know the community. So I'm glad that's moving forward. When we took a racial equity training as a council with the superintendent of schools and head of community college and a whole bunch of other people at the beginning of the year, and we've done several. And one of the exercises we did that stuck out to me that I wanted to bring up to you and make a suggestion, we just passed this racial equity bill, which requires over time all county staff to take the racial equity training. I think law enforcement and public safety in particular should be at the top of that list because of a lot of interaction with the public. But one of the exercises we took, you had to put a bunch of white pieces of paper on the board, and you had to write down different ethnic groups, so Black, Latino, Asian, and write down what are the stereotypes that you associate with those groups, and whether they're negative or positive. And what you saw at the end, and these are people who are in a racial equity training knowing that this is why we're doing this, you saw the Black and Latino whiteboards full. Words were teaming off of them. Asian, less so, white, even less. And then when you broke them down, the stereotypes were overwhelmingly negative for Black and Latinos, for example. And the fact that whites really didn't have a lot of stereotypes. It just wasn't a stereotype. And so not that the people wrote them necessarily ascribed to them, but they were aware that they existed, i.e. African Americans are lazy, Latinos are illegal immigrants. These are things not I subscribe to, but again, that were on the chart. And I bring it up because I think in the law enforcement context, we all have these unconscious biases that society has and that we individually have. Maybe we don't subscribe to them. And I just think it's really important to work extra hard in the law enforcement context when we're meeting people, again, not on their best day, as I've heard you say before, that we're really working hard to try to counteract those. So I say all that to say I hope that you all in the executive, now that we've got this bill in place, will, in addition to going to the African American History Museum, in addition to what you're doing, really prioritize the racial equity training, because I think that we need to constantly be working on that. And I don't know if you want to comment on that, but.
No, I don't disagree with you at all. I think that, again, this is, it's one of our challenges is for us to be able to move forward with these types of trainings. And I'm never dismissive of any of this being what I deem to be very important. I do want this community to know that, we've focused on implicit bias training for this department. We've taken it very seriously for that in aspect, and I think that we could always grow and continue to get better, because I think people need to understand as we move forward in time, we always are going to bring on new officers, new employees that really need to make sure that they are engaged and they are aware of these biases, and that this type of training is valuable. And so I would embrace this. I would not push this to say we don't need it because we've done X, Y, and Z over the years. I think that, again, when we talked about the amount of hours that we can put towards training, the amount of commitment that we can do that we deem to be vitally important, we have to understand there's going to be a cost to that, right? Not just for the fact that it's a monetary cost, but you're now pulling our folks off the road in order to do a full day of training in addition to what we already have to do. So, but we're committed to that. I think it's vitally important for us to be able to make sure that people understand the dynamics that go on in our community and be rightly aware of that.
I appreciate that. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. So, at the early part of the presentation, we had noted also that we're starting to do our bias training annually now, rather than every other year. So that's one piece. I know Captain Kokinos has some other notes that he wants to hit.
So the bias training was required every other year. We're now going to be doing it starting this year every year. And a couple of things we've done in the recruit world is we've incorporated education on 21st century policing and community perceptions and things of that nature. The other thing we've done is we've added additional training in our recruit curriculum for racial profiling regarding traffic stops and things of that nature. And then we've partnered with University of Maryland in their bias-free program, and we have instructors that in 2019 went through training there. It's a certification. We also sent instructors, and I personally attended both of these as the training director myself, to the Fair and Impartial Policing program, which they've updated training curriculum there, which we're going to be doing now in 2020. There's a new supervisor recognizing bias within your employees for the supervisors. They'll be trained in that. And then we're going to be updating our recruit. We have a bias, an entire day of bias training, which covers stereotypes and things of that nature, assumptions. We're going to be updating that curriculum based on the latest stuff we received in the new instructor program. So that's at the top of the list for 2020.
Wonderful. I appreciate all those updates. And I will say that racial equity training is supporting of that, in that it goes into the deep, more cultural reasons things developed the way they did. Not just that they exist now, which is important, like bias training is like, don't do this, but how did it happen? How did we come to have these biases, which I think goes to a deeper level of understanding and is something to pull on for officers. So I think it'll be a good accompaniment. Just two other questions. The school resource officer, and I've asked Chief Jones about this in the past. On Circle 23 in the survey, question 8, it says, in 2018, did your academy provide basic training for the following positions? And F, the school resources officer, and there's a check of no. And then in previous conversations, I had asked Chief Jones, and you kind of went into this a little bit, Assistant Chief Patel, are the school resource officers getting any sort of specialized training to deal with the young people that they're dealing with? This is kind of following Councilmember Hucker's discussion. I had understood that to be no, but I would like to know if that, maybe I misunderstood that, and if there's any plans to change that.
So the answer why it was no in the survey, because it was pertaining to recruit curriculum.
Okay.
And so the SRO program has, the recruits have no training whatsoever as it relates to school resourcing.
So what about the school resource officers? Once you're identified,
Yes.
and you're going to do it, what do you get that's
There's training through the state, that the state mandates, that they have specific training that they will do throughout the year. We have special training dates for them, sort of their own in-service training, you might say, prior to the start of any school year. So for example, let's say the school year's ended, one of these officers who might have been in the program decides that they're leaving the program. They might retire, they might just decide to go to another assignment. And we have to replace that school resource officer, or multiple ones. But all of them will go to that annual training, as well as any mandated training by the state. And there's a number of hours. I don't know those right off the top of my head, but I know one of the things that I've been really kind of working hard at and looking towards is really centralizing our school resource office team, so they are on one command, and they'll be given the direction and the training that they need to make sure we're not missing anything in regards to that. But I know we do have a sergeant in our community engagement division now who oversees all of their training, who makes sure that those blocks are checked and the certifications are sent to the state, and we keep those on file.
And might I just add, I've actually gone to their training. I mean, not that I sat through the entire event, but I was there for several hours, and it's pretty extensive and pretty impressive. It really is.
Well, that's great to hear that. I was aware of the state bill. I know Councilmember Rice worked on that. To the extent that maybe we can have some follow-up on what that entails, just with my, in particular, we're considering issues related to that right now, and I like the centralized idea. I think that's right. You create a culture and they support each other, and have central command. They're hearing the same things from the same people, and so I think that makes a lot of sense too. And I'm assuming, to Councilmember Hucker's point, there could be some opportunities for additional, training that is based on what we know now psychologically with our young people that maybe they're not getting, and just kind of test that out against what the state is offering. So if that's something I'd love to look into. And then the last point, you mentioned, or there was mentioned in the packet about there's training on how officers respond to observing the use of excessive force. I thought I read that somewhere. And okay, Susan said, yes, she put it in there. Could you talk about what that is and what they're trained to do? And obviously this is especially important in light of some of the recent situations last year that we had with officer was charged, for example, and convicted in an assault case. But also, in addition to the use of force, what just general lack of professionalism. You know, one of the things what stress prevention was asked about, but the professionalism, stress prevention, and ethics and integrity were all kind of below according to the survey as far as the training hours. And so if you observe an officer using, calling someone out of their name or using a racial slur, for example, what is the training? It might not be illegal, it's not a crime, it's not an assault, but what is the training like for those officers to respond, and has that changed over time since these incidents? I know it's a big question, but.
And before they answer, I did want to point out, and it's probably before you got here, but they did say that the survey is not absolutely reflective of all the training that they receive, and it shouldn't be lost in that, because not each block could they check off, but of course they blend many other things associated with it. So, yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, the survey asked like specific topics, and so a lot of our training in our particular academy, everything's interwoven throughout. So for example, professionalism, there's not just a 2-hour block. We do the ethics, we do values, we do how to interact and communicate with the public, but then they're tested through scenarios where we have role players from different genders and races that they have to interact with and things of that nature. The chief did touch, I won't spend too much time talking about our museum trips, African American Museum, Holocaust Museum. The professional training came out, all members of the police department in 2019 got a professional policing training that went on, that was done through our in-service program. And we did touch on a number of things from dealing with the public. We go over our values and expectations, professionalism, and then we do have a portion in there about intervening. So if you and I are on a scene of a call and I see that you and a community member maybe are starting to escalate, my duty as the calm other officer to potentially interject and say, hey, Officer Jawando, I'll take, let me pick up from this, and hopefully trying to de-escalate the situation. So we give that type of training and direction and guidance, and that's really our expectation in lieu of some things that have happened.
And is there in addition to that training, is there a direction for officers to report? How are they trained to, and the case I'm thinking of here, where the officer was charged and no one moved, right, and to intervene or to react or to report at the Aspen Hill McDonald's. So I'm just trying to get at the underlying training question, and is there something, obviously in any situation someone can freeze up, but that happens, but are we training people, if you do observe it and you don't get to the point where you intervene and something has happened, what are your officers trained to do as far as the intervention, but also after the fact?
So part of this is what I think what Captain Kikino's just noted on is about trying to emphasize this in a scenario based and trying to get them to understand, even in the online module, about their intervention, what we expect them to try to get in to help to de-escalate. We are currently working on a policy of intervention for our officers. It's something that we're going to have to work through, but we're working on a policy of intervention to make sure that officers are aware that that if they're on the scene of something, there is an expectation that, again, it's policy, it's a guidance. It's not an absolute. Every situation is different. Scenarios are different, and we can't dictate to every scenario, but we'll give them sort of these guidelines of our expectations of officers, the need to step in, and if something is out of, they think is unprofessional, that they have the right to make a complaint or, to acknowledge that to a supervisor or another alternative such as internal affairs, which happens now. In some cases, we've had people who've reported certain incidents that they think that didn't meet the sort of the muster that that needed to be addressed.
So not on, just to clarify, not the right, but a duty the
For the
policy.
duty,
So they have a
absolutely.
duty to do it.
Absolutely.
You should do it, and
Yes.
that's what the policy, and so I'm assuming there'll be some training modules that would come out of the policy that might
Right.
impact how you do the training now?
Well, it would be connected to, I mean, if we created this policy, we would provide training of what our expectations would be. Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councilmember Rice, please.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate your indulgence. I'm going to try and just be very quick. The Maryland law that actually was Senate Bill 1265, the Safe to Learn Act, actually required that there was a mandatory curriculum that's set up by the state for school resource officers. And what I think will be helpful is because so many people have a lot of questions, they just don't know. It'd be helpful to see what exactly that training entails, what those requirements are, so that the public can see and understand the very specific nature with which folks have to be trained as school resource officers. It's, again, not to diminish what any of our patrol officers get in their initial training for the recruits, but it is more intensive because it is understood you're going to be working with a different cohort. And so it's very targeted to them. I know that Ed, who helped to develop this, working in conjunction, who's worked in our school system for a very long time, is very passionate about this. And layered on top of that, we have our MOU. I think that those kinds of things, and again, so my question is, are we going to be revisiting the MOU between Montgomery County Police Department and Montgomery County Public Schools, understanding our new tinge on community policing, as well as our stress in terms of saying about racial equity and social justice, and do we want to weave some of those things incorporated into what this new MOU may look like if we're going that direction?
Yeah, so absolutely. So part of my vision has been to have a discussion with MCPS to address some major concerns that folks have in our school systems, particularly with the prisoner pipeline discussion and racial and social justice, and looking at it from a standpoint of how can we sort of divert some of these situations that we are sometimes brought into by school staff. And clearly there are clear directions in our MOU about what officers can arrest for on site. And those are some of your more violent type of incidents or more serious, such as bringing a weapon to school would be an example. Those are sort of not non-debatable. That's an arrest on site. But there are other incidents that might occur in the school, for example, that an officer does not observe, that's not listed as a part of that particular MOU, that an officer doesn't have the right to basically arrest that student on site because we don't have the powers of arrest, A, to do it, and B, it's not in the MOU. And so basically what would happen is the officer would handle it in a way that he would document, or she would document that particular incident on paper. And if it's a situation that, let's say it's an assault, okay, and there was a fight between a student, or one student just started hitting another student, and it's an allegation of an assault. Well, that would be documented, and sort of that's what you call an arrest on paper, okay? So unlike adults, when we don't see those types of incidents that occur, an adult can go to see the district court commissioner to actually get charges for another adult. Well, a juvenile, that's not the way it's done in the juvenile system. So it's done through our Department of Juvenile Services that now looks at this matter a lot differently. But what I'd like us to be able to try to work with Dr. Smith on, and maybe looking at some other diversion programs prior to us really kind of moving that to a DGS mode. Now, some students might not be eligible based upon sort of my vision, but then there's some that I think would be eligible, and that we could come up with some ways to try to make this a little bit smoother, and to keep some of our students clearly out of the juvenile system, because there's other ways that we could probably rectify these types of situations.
Well, I think it's incredibly important. And again, as we're talking about training today, I don't want to get lost and go too far down the rabbit hole of school resource officers. I will just say that when it comes to the training aspect, I think that our officers, just anecdotally from my experience, and I've been able to do shadowing with a number of them, have been trained very well. in terms of how to handle situations. I've seen situations, and I'm not going to name officers because I don't know if it violates the particular policy, in which they've had what I think would be an option on whether or not to actually arrest a student and chose not to do so. And those are the kinds of things that, again, playing in terms of a person who's a legislator in front of them, I'm sure may even make it a little bit more dicey. It's a very interesting thing because, as a lot of folks assume, that the strong voices that are out there talking about non-policing of their schools and say that that's a passion, there are parents out there who want their children protected as well. And so we can't just think that this is one-sided in terms of that there aren't parents who don't want to have kids with drugs in their school, who don't want to have kids with knives in their school, or even feel as though, even though it's just a BB gun and, it couldn't potentially kill somebody, and even though we know realistically it possibly could, but nonetheless, there are parents who would want that child to be expelled from the school, let alone, just have a, documentation in their file. So you're really talking about a person who has to have the training to understand the nuanced views that are within that school, as well as balance that with where the principal is. That requires a lot. And so I just want to say, going back to training, that's the reason why I think we have to do a very robust job when it comes to ensuring that our officers have the resources, that there's a very explicit line for them to follow, so that we could explain to parents how the process works, so that they can understand. And I also want to dispel, while there may be in other jurisdictions, this school to prison pipeline. Let me just be very clear. We're not arresting tons of kids in our school. And the data shows that. So, while we don't want there to be a school to prison pipeline, and there is nationally a school to prison pipeline, here in Montgomery County, we try on every single aspect to avoid a school to prison pipeline. So I just want to be very clear about that, because we keep bringing that up over and over again, and it makes it seem as though when you keep saying something, it makes it seem as though it's true. One of the requirements that's a part of MCSS and the Safe to Learn Act is actual reporting of the number of incidents that happen between school resource officers. So I'd also like to request that we get that disseminated to all council members as well, so that they can see directly the number of interactions that we have with our school resource officers and what those result in. I know just the other day we had an incident, and I brought it up about the BB gun because it was at my daughter's school, to where a person brought a BB gun to school. And so from that perspective, look, those are automatic. We know you bring a weapon to school, things are going to happen. And regardless of whether there's a school resource officer there or not, the police are going to be called. When a weapon is involved, you don't know what the weapon is, all those kinds of things. You may assume it's a BB gun, but you don't know. You have to call. And so from that perspective, that's there. I also wanted to just highlight in terms of training as well about one of the other things that was brought up at the public hearing, which was about the counterfeit money. Because that was a very tragic story in which a child, and the parents for that matter, but mainly about the child, was kind of traumatized in this whole situation. But the reality is that was done by the teacher. And the teacher is the one who then went to the administrator, and they're the ones who escalated that to actually call and have Secret Service involved when you're talking about counterfeiting. It was not the actual impetus of the officer. In fact, there wasn't a school resource officer that was at that school. They were assigned to another school and were called based on what the administrator and the teacher decided. And so I think that part of what we do in terms of training is going to be to make sure that our staff know about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate also. It's great to have the school resource officer have the training and understand what some of the things are, but it would be helpful to at least work with our Montgomery County Public School staff to make sure that they understand what's appropriate to elevate to the level of calling in, our law enforcement or not, and certainly something where a child is bringing some, whether it's counterfeit or not, that's certainly something you could take up with the parents and bring them in to have a conversation, but doesn't warrant us calling police. It's not as though the child is running a counterfeiting operation, and we shouldn't think anything of that nature, right? So I think that that would help, again, from a training aspect, as we can continue to address these very highly publicized incidents that really cast a negative light on our police department when it really wasn't the impetus of the police department that actually caused the incident to happen in the first place. I don't know if you wanted to respond to that or not.
I will respond this way, just from a standpoint of, this has been a discussion I've had with Dr. Smith and Mr. Clark with security about police and staff relationships. And so, and SRO and principal relationships is particularly. And so one of the things I think, even from a standpoint that there's sometimes we get called to do investigations, and there's sort of things that are not done properly that will kind of take the situation out of hand. And so one of the things that I've discussed with Dr. Smith, and it's planned to have a follow-up, is to come up with a training, a joint training with our principals, our commanders, our directors of these divisions, and bring in the subject matter experts of our investigators and the SROs to talk to them about what they see as sometimes that can be problematic in relation to some of these things that, where their staff is saying, a certain student is acting up, and it's as if they want us to correct a problem. And we want to make sure that we are not sort of the end to the end game, because we're there to support. We're not there to sort of, police every situation that we notice. Sometimes some schools do it much better than others. And again, I know some that we've had some issues with, and it's some of the conversation we've had with MCPS before. So we're going to continue that, and that's something that's high on my agenda for us to have better relationships that I think will help us in the long run and help to resolve matters at a more basic level, and it doesn't escalate. So,
Thank you. Councilmember Albernos, please.
Thank you. Just a couple final comments/questions from me. So we've talked a lot this year, correctly, about the issue of trust. Everybody agrees that that's critically important to this dynamic to ensure public safety all the way around. And, I've been very supportive and proud of the efforts of my colleagues on this council to enact legislation to help further that trust, which I think is going to, again, lift all boats and help our entire community. I think in the space of training, there's a real opportunity. We have tremendous, as you know, and MCPD has a long history of partnerships and alliances with community-based organizations, acknowledging that this work has to be done holistically and not in a vacuum for us to really be effective. And I think my question is, do we or how do we incorporate feedback, partnerships, and alliance with some of those community-based organizations, specifically around training? Because oftentimes these organizations have the trust of the community, work so closely, and have worked for years to develop that trust. I'm thinking also within county government of our street outreach network. And so how do we, and if we do, or do we, and how do we work with community-based organizations to incorporate feedback into training? And if we don't, is there an opportunity for us to be more intentional about that moving forward?
So I would answer that in a way that we have, for example, I have the chief. I have advisory boards. I have I have 2 Latino advisory committees, and we have 1 African American liaison committee, and we meet with them monthly. I meet with them monthly. I bring my staff in. We bring in the training academy staff in, and we'll talk about different types of training we'll have, and they'll inquire most on their own. They bring those agenda items to us, and they inquire and they ask us about specific questions and things that they see as concerns, and we address them accordingly. And they will comment to us about the need that they think that there's some needs that might need to be addressed, and how could we go about addressing them. And I think, we're held accountable to that, and we generally will respond to them, in a way that we work with them. We do, things such as sharing other different types of processes that people understand clearly, that they get a better understanding, such as coming through our Citizens Academy, the Hispanic Communities Academy. So everybody understands that there's an avenue there of understanding it better. So I think we could always be better at that. And always willing to listen and come up with the different suggestions. But I at least want people to understand and make sure that they understand clearly how we develop what we develop and why we push these different types of programs and curriculum forward for our officers to make sure that they understand. Because there are some things that are mandated by the state, as an example, that we are required to do. So we have to make sure people understand all of those different dynamics, so.
I appreciate that, and I have a great deal of respect for our community advisory boards. I've attended those meetings before, and I know those folks work hard. I do think being more intentional about connecting to organizations who represent larger constituencies that they've worked very hard to develop is also important, because having those individual voices, and I think moving forward, having some time and space to connect with them specifically around training, I think would be helpful.
I'm sorry, if I may just jump in real quick to add. So one of the values of building training with the community to some degree, so something that I've done in the training division, is of value with the different committees that the chief has, is it allows us to gain, we can train cops how to do things, right? Legally, there's techniques, there's procedures. But the one thing that's valuable is, even though you could be doing something that's legal and it's a technique, what is the perception of the community member that you're interacting with? So there's great value in being able to share that from an awareness piece to the officers. So, hey, listen, you're going to do 1, 2, 3, and 4, but just be aware of this is what the other person may be thinking or feeling, and be able to kind of move with some fluid there, The other thing is, going forward in 2020, I've been in talks with our community engagement division, and I'm going to follow back around, is with having them involved in some of our in-service training this year. And I'm hoping they're the ones that have a lot of those relationships that you're speaking of, and we can tap the community engagement division. We're actually putting one of their staff members through our state instructor school this year coming up, to where I can incorporate and use them as instructors with their partnerships to try to build training in that world.
I appreciate that. That's a very thoughtful response. Last two questions are the trainers themselves. We talked about the trainees. We've talked a little bit about sort of the ongoing analysis of best practices from other jurisdictions, and obviously adjusting as state or federal regulations require. But how often do the trainers themselves receive additional training, and what does that look like?
Yeah, so not enough as I would like. But what they do is, every year our academy staff goes through the training that all officers are required. We have instructor training. So we'll go through the state curriculum, but then we'll also be training, it's kind of we invite our core team and our adjuncts that help us a lot, and we do division level training. Our instructors also have different certifications that they have to do. So whether it's protective instruments, we have recertifications for our defensive tactics, we have certifications in physical training, we have certifications. We just sent 2 instructors last fall to a de-escalation instructor school. There's another de-escalation school coming up in April. We have use of force training that they're certified in, that we send them to for that. We have an instructor going to that. The tough thing is, I'd like to send my whole team to this type of trainings, but staffing, we're running all the time, every week of the year. Some things require a minimum level of instructors for safety and whatever we're doing. So what I've had to do is kind of identify within the instructor core subject matter experts that I can send them, and they can bring it back and we can share it amongst ourselves, and that's like, a best way that we kind of do that. But they do get training, and we're trying to get them more in various topics.
Captain Kukino started in his assignment about 11 months ago. One of the things he's brought forward is that his staff needs to get more availability or more exposure to training, and what he's doing as he brings them forward and we analyze them together is not just we're going down one path. The instructors should be going to a variety of different trainings, and then we pick the best from those worlds, right? You may have one concept on de-escalation here, another one over here. Let's send, those same people as the best we can to those things and keep bringing it back. But it's something we're trying to enhance in our overall scheme this year is how do we, with the staffing challenges, get the people to get a wide variety of training throughout the nation to see, what are the best practices, not just one way of doing things, and then rebuild our training according to that. And if we send somebody, and we actually, I can't remember which one it was, but we sent kind of a scout out, if you will, to check out this one training and said, listen, let's send one person, let's see how it goes, and if it's worthwhile, then we'll double down and reinvest in more people so that we're spending our money appropriately and our time, and I think that's working.
So I left my checkbook at home, but if there is, obviously it's a budget issue, like so many issues. And the training component is so integral to the development of officers now and moving forward. I know this is something I'm personally interested in, I'm sure my colleagues are as well. So like so many competing interests in tough budget years, and we haven't had a great budget year in a long time, but this is an area that sort of a front-end investment has some real back-end ramifications, and those are areas that I'm particularly interested in. Thank you.
Thank you. Susan, is there anything else from you?
The only other thing I wanted to touch on, if the committee is interested, is the field training officers, how they're actually assigned to provide that field training to the new probationary officers, and their compensation structure, that type of thing. I'm just wondering what kind of impact that has, since we're having recruiting challenges and staffing challenges in general. Are they taken off duty from their regular assignment to do that, and how that basically influences operations?
Okay.
So our field training officers, these are so you go through the 25-week core academy, then you graduate per the state standard. We actually keep them additional 2 weeks to do training outside of what is in the state training. And then they go out to 14 weeks of field training. And each police district has training teams, and the chief of Patrol Services Bureau will assign new recruits to based on staffing needs, and they'll pair up with these training officers. The training officers, they have a normal duty of responding to calls. Or patrol officers. This is an added job. They volunteer for this assignment at this time, and there is additional compensation of about, I think it's $3.50 an hour. They get to train a new recruit. The difficulties in that, over the last year, we lost about 100 of our field training officers, which if that trend continues will be very problematic for us in our ability to train. There's a lot of challenges with training. So you have an officer that comes to work, does their job, and now for $3.50 more an hour, I'm saying, hey, I'm going to put this person that's fresh out of the academy, you're now responsible for them. And they have a gun, and they have training, and they have things that you need to now expand upon from the academy. So it's an added stressor, because you have someone that has very little experience, and you're kind of watching for their safety. There's a lot of documentation that goes along with this, because if we do have a problem employee that's not successfully completing the program, that has to be well documented. Chief Patil has seen a binder that we have recommended termination for a recruit in field training that did not meet the standards of this agency. It's about 6 to 7 inches thick. The field training officers have to write daily reports on top of all the other work that they're doing. And if they have a problem recruit, the documentation is so labor intensive, it's not necessarily an appealing job. And I do thank and champion those that do sign up for the job, because it's not easy. But the compensation is a struggle. I know we've been working and trying to discuss those type of things.
Did they leave because they retired? Did they leave because they didn't like it? Why did you lose 100 people?
So some just didn't want to do it anymore. Maybe they felt burnt out. There's a variety of reasons. We lost a big wave when we have instituted, the state of Maryland actually has instituted, we have done it. Every 4 years they have to go through an in-service. It's 7 hours of training. So there was a number of field training officers that didn't meet the new state training requirements, so their field training officer certification was suspended, and they elected not to renew it. There may be a variety of reasons why they didn't.
If I could add to that, the one thing that I think that's important for everybody to understand, all of us that are police officers will never ever forget who our field training officer was. That's sort of a unique bond in its own right, because it's like you could always say, this is the person that trained me when I came on the job, and developed a different, unique relationship. And there are challenges when, we have recruit classes coming out every 6 months, and you have officers who have been field training officers for quite some time. And I will tell you, being a commander of a station, that I remember folks that were at my station that took great pride in being, and still take great pride in being, field training officers. It is an added amount of responsibility, it's no doubt about that, but the reality is that a lot of them take great pride in it. One of the challenges that we have is that we say to our commanders is that they need to be having their supervisors identifying new folks who are willing to step up to the plate and be field training officers, and encourage them to go to FTO school in order to become a field training, and when we know that they have the maturity, the experience to actually train new recruits and provide them with proper guidance and direction. And that, again, and it does, and again, when we look at the amount of people that we bring through the academy through each year, in the different districts, you have different districts that have higher needs. So therefore, they're going to get more recruits probably to train. And there's more of a burden on them comparably to some other districts that may not have that burden. So it's a constant challenge for us. It's no doubt about it, but I will tell you, I think there are a lot of folks that are out there that take a lot of pride in what they do, and they do a really good job of doing it. So, and we recognize them for such.
Thank you. Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you. And I'm glad you talked about how important that is, the field training officer. It's like, as a lawyer, you go to law school, you go to train, and then you come out, and then you learn how to actually practice law. And the person that you were under, those are lasting relationships. So that's a critical relationship. So we need to. It's troubling that those numbers are going in that direction, because that's an important person. So we need to continue to talk about that. I did have one question that I missed last time. We often talk about, a third of our residents being foreign-born. We, the council, and what that means. The committee hearing we had just before this was with McHale, and getting an update, Montgomery Coalition for Adult English Literacy. And so we're really working on it on both ends, on how do we get those who are limited English proficient up to speed, particularly our adults in the schools. We have a whole set of programs, dual language and the like. Is there any training related to, obviously you're not going to learn new language in the academy, but are there basic commands and literacy training and for officers, knowing that we're going to, for example, encounter a lot of people that are speaking Spanish? And obviously we want to recruit officers who speak it, but is there any basic language training?
There is. We have a Spanish instructor on site at our training academy. And we've had that at our training academy for about the last 14 years. When we have basic Spanish class and we have an advanced Spanish class. And we do have officers who take advantage of those opportunities of coming up to the academy to actually get trained in Spanish, from a basic level of commands, as what you're noting. And for those who really want to learn the language, we've had folks who've actually gone and done that as well. I think that's a successful part of what we do. We continue to, impress upon our officers, for those who are interested, to continue to do that to the best of their ability.
Just to be clear, does every one in the academy get some level? It's a voluntary system at this point?
Yeah, for the most part, because again of restrictions of time, it is a voluntary part of instruction for folks that want to do it. But we do get some folks who are very interested.
Are there any other languages taught at the academy?
We don't have any other languages that are taught at the academy. We have not had any other language or instructor hired to do that. Again, our officers are instructed, though, how to find individuals who do speak the language if they run into an issue with an individual who speaks the language and doesn't speak English. So we use the language line that is readily available 24/7. And in most cases, you'll sometimes have officers who are themselves bilingual. They actually do get paid a little bit extra of differential to assist with their language skills. And we'll bring those officers to calls if we need them, if they're available, in order to speak a language to help to interpret. But again, if an officer is not available or another, in fact, there's a county employee list of folks that we'll also tap into, and that information is given to every officer. And again, if we can't find anybody during the normal work hours, we utilize the language line.
I mentioned it downstairs, and I mention it every time I can. Rosetta Stone is free at your public library, and people don't know that. So for anyone that wants to learn, thank you.
And that was from the lead on public libraries for the county. Did you have something? Go ahead.
Just curious, sounds like there's a story, maybe you don't want to tell it here. Why two Latino advisory committees?
I don't know the true background behind that, but there's one group of folks that we meet that I would deem to be more connected with different agencies, not just not advocacy groups, but they're different agencies, school systems. We deal with the Crisis Center a lot of, and Chief Manger created this a few years back. So I've just decided to continue to pat you with the torch and run with it. So a lot of useful information is shared amongst both of those groups. And so just like with any other advocacy group, as I think Mr. Albanaz was speaking of, such as, that I will go out and speak in front of and answer questions and talk about training such as the NAACP and other groups, but yeah, we have an African American Advisory Board as well. So, okay.
Just getting back to the field training officer for 1 second. If someone is going for a promotion, I know you give a test and you do other things before they're promoted, but does the fact that they were a field training officer, the fact that they're bilingual, the fact that they've done other things beyond the test, is that entered into how the promotion could take place?
So for the rank of corporal and sergeant, the answer is technically no. And the reason why it's no is because literally they take a test, and the test results of the rank and order in which they come is how they get promoted. Now their performance evaluations are looked at and are part of the evaluation of final decision as it relates to promotion. So you could say it has some impact of it, but it doesn't put somebody who might be number 5 and push them up to number 1, because we take them in rank order. Okay.
Susan, was that everything? Is it? Well, first off, thank you all very, very, I don't see any of the lights on, so they'll jump in if I'm wrong. But thank you all very, very much for being here, and really for what you do, and to the entire department. I mean, all the law enforcement agencies that are associated in Montgomery County. We appreciate it. It is not an easy job. We've said that many, many times. It's probably gotten more difficult the last couple of years, and we're appreciative that you all do the great job that you do, and we thank you. And we are adjourned.